I met someone who no longer seems to exist. Probably going to get buried, but I met someone who no longer seems to exist. In 2018, I developed tendonitis in my hand, so I went to see a hand specialist at my regular hospital. I remember the hand specialist really clearly. She was a really happy, talkative Vietnamese woman with straight, dark brown hair and glasses. She had a German sounding last name, which I assumed was her married name. She was really, really nice, and we had a long conversation about a medical conference that she was going to. She explained that my hand issues caused by phone usage were the hot topic of the conference, and that she's probably going to use my injury as an example when she goes there. Anyway, she gave me care instructions and sent me home. I was told to return if it didn't resolve in a few weeks because then I'd be re-examined and sent to physical therapy. It didn't resolve and I went back. I had an appointment with the same doctor, but the woman who came in the room was completely different. She was a white woman with light brown hair, no glasses, completely different face shape, really dull and unwelcoming disposition. I was fucking confused. I asked her name, and she gave me the same name the Asian doctor had. I asked if there was another doctor by that name, and she told me no. It was only her. I described the doctor I had seen, and she got really annoyed and said she didn't know who I was talking about. I later went online to the hospital staff directory and tried to find the Asian doctor. I couldn't. I have no idea what happened to her. I even checked my medical records to see if maybe I remembered her name incorrectly, but I didn't. Both of my visits had the same doctor's names on them. I've always been confused about this, and it really bothers me that I met someone who doesn't seem to exist anymore. My bed was moved in my studio apartment while I was at work. This was about 7 years ago and I honestly forgot about it, likely for my own sanity, until one of my friends made a comment about people who hid inside other people's homes. So, this story likely has a rational explanation, but it's terrifying, and I'll never know the truth. I had recently moved to a tiny basement studio apartment. I was fresh out of a 6-year relationship, and it was my first time living alone. The apartment had bars over the 2 windows, and the door opened up to the busy city street. There was a spot on the wall that looked like it was once a window, but had been boarded up with a wooden door without a handle. A few weeks after moving in, I got curious and tried opening the door. I couldn't get it to budge, and even had a guy friend come over and try. This thing wouldn't move in the slightest. Something about it weirded me out though. I ended up putting my bed right up against it, and shortly after, decided to tape a clear sheet of window sealer stuff to keep the draft out and make it feel less unsettling to me. I duct taped the sheet over the sealed up cutout and went about my day. The next morning I went to work and came home as usual. I unlocked my door and when I stepped inside, I was terrified. My bed had been pushed away from the wall. And the taped up window seal sheet had been removed. I went over to the cutout door and the wooden door with no handle opened up very easily. I was scared, but I looked inside. It was the size of a closet, was very dirty / dusty, and had a single wooden wheel like from a horse-drawn carriage. Aside from that, it was empty. I immediately called the company I rented from, terrible company, and explained what happened and asked if someone came in to do maintenance or anything. They said no, so I asked if there was any possibility that a previous tenant could have access. They basically told me I was crazy. It took over a month of harassing them to get them to change my lock. I never found out what that was all about. At the time, I guessed that an old tenant had money or drugs or valuables hidden there, that they came back for a literal day after I sealed it up. But now, I hate to think of it, but it's a possibility that someone was inside it all along. I never resealed it after that, and even though I had looked inside that hole from wall to wall, I'm not certain the person ever left. Maybe 5 months later, I came home to a single unopened bear on the ledge of my front door. It was a bear I'd never heard of. In no way bought by me. I was so happy to get out of that hellhole. And for anyone wondering, after some contemplation, I drank the beer. Edit. Some asked for some specifics, and it fueled my frustration at not having any photos saved from that time frame. But I am determined. I remember that I posted a lot on social media that year because I was newly single and sad and lonely. So I reactivated my dead Facebook account for y'all and found the proof. It's funny to see the effect 6 years has on one's memory. You'll see in the link that I didn't get every detail right, but it very much happened. As for it being a previous tenant, it's of course a possibility, but I moved in August. This happened in January, 5 months after I moved in. The bear appeared 3 months later in April. And yes, it took me 5 months to get my shit together and cover the eerie drafty cutout. I was sad, and it added to my feelings of it getting torn down so quickly. A couple years ago, I lost a ring my grandma got me for Christmas. I wore this ring 24/7 and rarely ever took it off. However, when I did take it off, I'd always put it in the same place so I wouldn't lose it. This ring meant a lot to me because sadly my grandma passed away from cancer shortly after. One day, I remember looking down at my hand and started to panic because my ring wasn't on my finger. Before getting really upset, I went and checked my usual spot where I put it, but it wasn't there. I remember telling my family and having them search the whole house. Anyways, I lost it a couple weeks before Christmas, so my family told me they'd get me another one. After they told me this, I went down to my basement to do my wash, and when I was putting my clothes into the dryer, I felt something hit my head and fall onto the floor in front of me. Lo and behold, it was my ring. It literally fell out of thin air. I told myself it was a little message from my grandma, but it was one of the weirdest things. Still to this day, I think about it. I found a new restaurant on Uber Eats and caved when the app gave me a coupon. I ordered from it and fat fingered the tip, lol. The delivery person is thinking they'll get $100, but I can't afford this. Anyone have any idea how to fix this? They'll be here in 15 minutes. Edit. So, I looked up the restaurant to call them, and it turns out I can't find it. It's probably a ghost kitchen, as one of you pointed out, that doesn't have any physical stores. I'm just going to cancel the order. Everything pizza sounds tasty, but not a tenth of a paycheck tasty. Sorry. Edit. Well, I just had an experience. Delivery person still came. I turned the lights out and pretended I wasn't there, but he just kept ringing the doorbell. And the dog started barking, so I finally opened the door. He was kind of scruffy, but I can't judge because I know food delivery is tough. I told him I canceled the order and he can eat my dinner for all I care, but he didn't even shake his head. He just kept saying, "Everything will be okay," until I took the box from his hands. I felt kind of bad, so I tried to give him a $10 bill, but he didn't even move. I just took the box and closed the door, and he's still out there. Edit. Delivery person finally left. Sorry to worry some of you guys. I don't need to call the cops though, just cause someone's so damn weird. Don't know how he delivers meals on time though, cause he's so slow. Hygiene kind of bad too. I looked on the Ring camera and when he was walking away, I saw some wax come out of his ears. So gross. But I've seen worse in college, so I'll live. I'm more pissed that there's a half-eaten slice in my pizza. Free is free, but come on. At least eat the whole slice if you're gonna eat something. That's even more gross. Edit. No, I'm not going to post a picture of this pizza. I'm hungry. I just want to eat. Edit. There's weird shit on this pizza. Are anchovies supposed to move? Ate a slice, a couple slices, but not eating those fish. They're definitely raw and look slimier than usual. Gotta go to sleep now. Pizza's a 3 out of 10, but it's free, so we take these. This is the final update. Edit. Just woke up. Stomach feels fine, but my ears feel weird. Maybe make it a 2 out of 10. Sorry I said it was the final update, but I thought I'd be asleep and not up at 3 a.m. lol. Was hungry again. Yes, I know I'm a big eater. And opened up the pizza box, but it looked like some of the toppings are gone. And the anchovies are on the floor. I looked around and some are even in my bedroom, lol. Wonder if my dog got to it. If we can open up and close pizza boxes, I gotta post that to Reddit. Edit. My ears still feel kind of weird, kind of buzzy. My stomach hurts too, but maybe from stress. A commenter mentioned that sometimes ears get clogged from wax, but I kind of feel a weird wet sensation in there. I'll check it out later. Sorry for treating this like a personal blog. ITT, free pizza, and OP complains about their health anxiety. Mod, remove this if this is too much information. Edit. Air still feels weird, like really weird. My dog started barking at me too. I can't sleep. Edit. Don't know what's up, but it's def not wax. Pain is getting more. Edit. 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 Everything feels better now. Edit. Edit. Everything will be okay. This happened about a year ago. I was going hiking by myself in a local area. It wasn't difficult, and I had been there before, just not on this path. Even though it was easy, I took too long and had to turn around instead of finishing the loop to beat the sunset, emphasis on it being a loop. The path was marked with bright trail paint, and I followed it back to the trailhead. There were just a few random branches of trails that connected the loop to itself, but I recognized all of them as they had large map borders, and never once did I ever feel that I was lost. Sun started to set though, and I still wasn't back to where the trail began. I was worried I had somehow missed the opening, a giant sign/opening in the trees, and ended up on the other side of the loop, so I turned around and walked a short distance back. After walking a tiny way back, I stumbled upon an opening as I described. Very large break in trees, huge map sign. I felt incredibly discombobulated that I could miss it, but I was just glad to be out. However, my car wasn't there. This is a tiny nature park area in my city, where there is one entrance to the loop that is just a break in the trees. The trailhead is just between 10 yards of playground/green area from a parking lot of 4 parking spaces, then a road. I was freaking out thinking my car had just gotten stolen to the point I almost called the cops. My phone had no service though. I started walking on the actual road in this area out of deep confusion/fear of it becoming night. I double checked the trailheader to see if it was the same or if I got off path. Again, I couldn't find any evidence I was somewhere new or on a different trail. I continued walking down this road and I passed a small line of trees that showed an exact replica of the parking lot I had just walked from. Except my car was actually there. Of course, I was just relieved and feeling stupid, so I went home. To visualize what I saw when I walked, imagine the road is a B shape, with the 2 curves being the parking lot and the middle line being trees and the first line being the road. Something felt weird all night though, so I drove back in the daylight the next day. There was only one parking lot. There was only one trailhead. I completely walked the trail this time, the whole loop, and I couldn't find any other trailhead or playground. I drove the entire road and around the natural park, not a single park similar to where I was. Should be noted that this was a very clean, well-marked loop for beginners. I looked at a map of all the trails and none of them were close enough to this loop for me to even stumble upon them, and that's pretending there are 2 trailheads to find. I don't even believe the Matrix theory, but I really felt like a character walking through a game that's glitching and making copies of buildings. I'm not spiritual either, but even my religious friends I've told have made conspiracies that some higher power was protecting me by getting me out of the woods. I must be going crazy. I could see a town that doesn't exist. My name is Samuel Baker. I'm a Yellowstone National Park ranger, and I need some advice. I spent my entire career fighting wildfires for the National Park Service, and after 2 decades in the field, I thought I'd seen everything. Then, about 4 hours ago, an entire town just appeared in the middle of Yellowstone National Park, and the other ranger and I are the only ones who've been in it. We're not alone, however, as you might expect from something appearing out of nowhere inside of one of America's most famous parks. The town is home to many people, some of whom have been there for years. They all seem perfectly normal, but they aren't aware that they live inside a national park. My partner, Thomas, was the first to notice the town. He'd driven into the valley a few hours before dawn one morning and saw a brand new sign on the road. "Welcome to Hungry Horse," it read. When he drove past the next bend in the road, he saw the motel. That's when he turned around to come and get me. The two of us had driven up the valley together in our trusty old Chevy Blazer and taken a long way around because we hadn't wanted to pass through the town until we were sure what it was. We parked at the base of the mountain and hiked up. We walked across the railroad tracks and past a small gas station with a lone oil drum full of diesel fuel and another filled with water. The street was lined with old cars, some of which looked like they'd been there for a while, others which had probably just arrived that morning. Hungry Horse wasn't a ghost town or even abandoned. It was thriving. Thomas and I entered the town cautiously because despite appearances, this place could be dangerous. While we didn't run into any trouble, we did notice that everyone seemed indifferent to the fact they just appeared out of nowhere. Most of them ignored us completely, although a few gave us strange looks. "Some of these people look familiar," I said, looking over at Thomas. He nodded.
"I know what you mean, Sam. I recognized a couple of people in the diner too. It's weird."
It's weird. Those words echoed in my head as I watched a man carrying a bucket walk down the sidewalk. "It's weird," I repeated silently to myself. My eyes followed his movements. The man carried himself with confidence and purpose, but he never looked up at where he was walking. Instead, he stared straight ahead and continued forward without looking back once. He disappeared around the corner of a building, and I noticed another person staring directly at me. He was tall and thin, wearing a black hiking jacket. His face was pale, and he was bald. He was standing in a doorway of a small coffee shop. He reminded me of the missing hiker we had searched for last week. That's when I realized why I recognized some of the people here. They are all people who have vanished from national parks. That's how we found out that almost every single person in Hungry Horse had been reported missing from national parks. We spoke to everyone we could find. Some refused to talk, others were friendly enough, but none of them knew anything about why they were there. As far as they were concerned, they lived in Hungry Horse, Montana. They weren't sure exactly when they arrived there. A lot of them couldn't remember much before arriving in Hungry Horse. They also told us they'd been here for years. Many of them had been born and raised in the town and believed it was the real deal. They all knew the townsfolk by name and went to school with them. One woman, an older lady named Irene, told us that she had no idea that she'd been reported missing. She worked at the hardware store and had been living in Hungry Horse for more than 45 years. "What about your husband?" I asked. "Do you have children? Grandchildren?" She shook her head. "No, I've never been married." "How do you feel being here? Do you miss anywhere else? Your family, maybe?" Again, she shook her head. "Not really. This is my home." As far as she knew, this was the only home she'd ever known. I tried to ask her if she missed her family, but she just smiled and told me that her family was right here in Hungry Horse, Montana. We thanked her and left the hardware store. Hopping back into our Power Ranger truck, we drove deeper into the town.
"I really don't like this, Sammy,"
Thomas said.
"I've had a feeling of being watched ever since we entered town."
I looked over at him. He was staring at a man standing by a large semi-trailer outside the diner. The man was holding a jug of milk. I couldn't help but think of the hiker we found dead last week.
Sam, are you listening to me?"
I snapped back to reality and looked at my partner. Thomas had started quivering in fear. "Sorry, what did you say?"
"I said I think we should leave. I don't want to be here anymore."
I looked around the town. There were so many people here. So many people who shouldn't be here. All of them were perfectly normal. Some of them even knew each other. How could there be so many people in a town that didn't exist? "I agree. Let's go," I said. We drove away from the town, back to the ranger's cabin. Thomas was still shaking.
"I'm gonna call this in,"
he said.
"This whole thing is bullshit, but we better document it anyway. I mean, how? How could an entire town full of missing people just appear in the middle of Yellowstone?
I nodded. Okay, I'll be in the cabin. I think I need some time to process all this shit. I sat down on the couch and closed my eyes. It felt unreal. I kept thinking about the hiker we found out in the woods last week. He died while on a hike in the wilderness. He'd been alone and confused, but I just saw him alive and well in a town that doesn't exist. I opened my eyes and looked around. I took in a deep breath and let it out. It smelled like wood smoke and pine. I stood up and started pacing the room. What am I supposed to make of all of this? I asked myself, is this some kind of sick joke? Did the government put a town in Yellowstone for some reason? What if it's not a town? Maybe it's a cover-up for something worse? I thought before zoning out. There was a knock on the door. It startled me out of my daydream. Come in, I yelled. 2 men came inside, both dressed in black suits. Are you the one in charge here? One of them asked. I looked at him and nodded. The guy was wearing a badge on his chest and a gun on his hip. He looked like an FBI agent. I'm about to go and talk to them, and I don't know if they'll believe me. What the fuck do I do? First off, let me clarify some things from my first post. I was a wildland firefighter up until a year ago, when I decided I needed a change of pace. They weren't FBI agents. They said they were from a private company that deals with the otherworldly. I sat in front of 2 men waiting for them to start asking questions. So, do you know why I've been assigned to this case? The taller one of the 2 said. You're the only one in the park who knows anything about this. I nodded. Thomas also knows, but I think you guys already know that. It's pretty weird. The town you described doesn't exist, not according to the GPS and satellite data. What? Yes, it does, I answered, surprised. It's a lie, the second man said. He had short blonde hair and wore glasses. We checked every single point on the map, every house, every business. There is nothing there. Bullshit. You can't tell me you've been everywhere in the park and haven't noticed it, I said angrily. When I first came to the park, I saw the sign for Hungry Horse. I thought it was a joke at first, but then I saw the motel, the gas station, the diner, the hardware store, and I saw the people inside of them. The man with the glasses nodded slowly. But we've checked every inch of the surrounding area. We've looked at aerial photos, satellite images. We've flown over the valley with a helicopter. Well, maybe you should have a look again. Maybe you missed something, I said defiantly. We did. There's nothing there. It's not possible. Do I have to fucking show you where it is myself? I asked. Both men exchanged glances. Then the shorter one nodded. Very well. If you're so sure you've seen something unusual, we'll take you there. Finally, thank you, I said. I got out of my chair and followed the 2 men out of the cabin. They were in their early 50s, both with short hair and blue eyes. They were talking quietly to each other as I followed them out of the cabin to their unmarked car. Now, the man with the glasses said, if you could just lead us to your town. Sure, I replied. We drove deeper into the park. Our vehicles was equipped with a topographical GPS system, which made it easy to navigate through the rugged terrain. After an hour of driving, we came to a hill overlooking a wide valley. We passed the sign for Hungry Horse. Hold on, did you just see the sign? I yelled. The men just looked at each other. I'm sorry, what? The shorter one asked. There's a sign here. It says Hungry Horse, right? The man shook his head. I don't see anything. He pulled off the road and stopped right before the sign. He turned off the engine and looked at me. Maybe we should get out and look again, he suggested. I agreed. I got out of the car and ran over to the sign. It's right here, I shouted. He walked up behind me and looked over my shoulder. What the hell is this? It's a sign. It says Hungry Horse, I yelled. He looked up at me and glared. I grabbed his arm and pulled him over to where I could see the sign. Can't you read? He pulled away and rolled his eyes. Read what? It says Hungry Horse, I yelled. What the hell are you talking about? He yelled back. I pointed at the sign. Look, the name of the town. The man sighed. There's no sign there. I got angry and I was about to yell at the agent when out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone walking towards us from out of the woods in the direction of the town. It was Irene, the older woman from the hardware store. My eyes lit up and I pointed at her. Irene! I yelled excitedly. The agent turned to face the old woman. His eyes widened in surprise and he opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, Irene hit him and sent him flying into a tree.
You shouldn't have come back, Ranger.
She hissed. With lightning speed, she charged the agent with the glasses. Run! I yelled and jumped into the car. It was too late for the agent. Irene had already snapped his neck. I frantically ran back to the unmarked car and tried to start it. The engine spluttered and failed to turn over. Irene stood directly in front of me, blocking my path to the cabin. What the fuck are you? I yelled.
You shouldn't have come here.
She said.
You have no idea what you're getting yourself into.
What the hell is going on? I yelled. She snarled and lunged forward. Her teeth had grown sharp and she snapped at me, but I evaded her bite and I rammed my fist into her stomach. God damn it, I yelled. I grabbed her shoulders and threw her into the side of the car. She slid across the hood and fell onto the ground. I jumped around the car and kicked her once in the ribs. I'm going to fucking kill you, I said. She smiled.
I've been dead for years, honey.
I was about to punch her again when a hand grabbed my arm and yanked me backwards. I spun around and stared at the person who grabbed my arm. It was Thomas, my partner. He had followed the agents and I. What the hell are you doing? I yelled.
Don't be stupid. We have to get back to the cabin.
I looked at him and shook my head. No, we can't run from these things, I said, flabbergasted. What the hell is wrong with you? He slapped me hard across the face.
Shut up. Shut the fuck up. Just shut up.
I rubbed my cheek and looked at Thomas in disbelief. What the hell are you talking about? His eyes were wide open with panic. I heard Irene starting to get up.
You have to leave. Now. Right fucking now.
He grabbed my collar and pushed me into the driver's seat of the dead agent's car.
Get in.
He yelled.
And drive.
What about you? I asked.
I can't fight them anymore. You know how many Rangers they've taken?
He said.
Just get out of here.
We just found out about this town yesterday. How do you know this shit? I yelled.
You just found out about the town.
He replied. The fuck does that mean?
Just go. I'll keep Irene occupied. Get back to the cabin and read my journal.
I don't believe this shit. He nodded.
I know.
I pulled on 180 and sped back down the road towards the cabin. I saw Thomas jump on Irene in the rearview mirror. He looked bigger than he usually does. He was standing on top of her, pinning her arms to the ground.
Fuck you!
Irene yelled. Thomas punched her in the face and she went limp.
Stay down, bitch.
The last thing I saw was Thomas running towards the town. I'm back at the cabin and reading through his journal. There's so much I never knew about him. This was about 20 years ago, back when VCRs and Blockbuster were still things. I had just finished watching Carpool with my family. It was hilarious, although I don't think I'd sit through it today. And the credits started rolling, so I jumped up and hit stop and rewind on the VCR. The tape clicked immediately, meaning it was completely rewound. I was like, huh? Sure enough, the tape started playing the anti-piracy thing at the beginning. Everyone in the room noticed and looked in complete silence. It made no sense. We watched the movie to the end credits. VCR movies could not rewind back to the start that fast. Somehow, it was as if a small chunk of time disappeared from us collectively. Explainer for young people. Back in the 1900s, it took a long time to rewind a movie. You had to push rewind 4 or 5 times to get all the way up to rewind times 16. And you actually watched a movie in reverse at times 16 speed. Or maybe it went up to times 32. I don't recall, but even still, it took a few minutes to rewind a movie. If you're old enough, you'll know what I'm talking about. I know it's not the craziest or weirdest thing to ever happen, but it was and still is inexplicable. When I was 10 years old, my mother took my brother and I on a picnic to Newman's Lake, about a half-an-hour drive from our home. She'd been looking for cheap ways to get us out of the house for the summer, and this was one of many picnics. This one in particular, however, stood out because it's when I found out how I would die. Nobody swims in Newman's Lake. Nobody smart does anyways. There are signs every few feet leading up to the water's edge that warn about alligators. Every once in a while you'd hear of talk of drunk teenagers who fell in, and the grisly fate they suffered. All this to say, I knew that when I died in Newman's Lake, it would be no accident that got me in the water. After we'd had our little sandwiches and fruit snacks by the water, Mom sat on the blanket to read a romance novel and left my brother and I to our own devices. My brother ran to the nearby woods to find a good walking sticks, and I slowly made my way to the rickety little dock that stretched nearly to the center of the lake. It looked ancient, like any sudden move would collapse it, and there was no railing between the decaying wood and the algae green lake. As I approached, I felt a sudden bout of dread. Did I really think it was wise to walk along the barely standing dock? Yet, still, as if compelled, I walked forward. I knew that moment I looked at the water, I'd lose my resolve. So as long as I walked along the pier, I studied my own feet against the wood. It felt like a balancing act simply to avoid the obvious rot and holes in the wood. But eventually, I reached the end of the pier and I looked out into the green water. As soon as I did, I felt the water pulling me in, begging me to look closer. For just a moment, I did. I looked at the weeds along the sand, and the snails and the small fish in the water. And beneath all of it, almost as if it were another, deeper level that no one else could access, I saw a jet black fish made of smoke. It was about the size of a goldfish, and it swirled within itself like a cloud of dark, spinning sand. I knew what it was the second I saw it. It was my death. I didn't know how I knew. I didn't know when it would get me, but I knew what it was. I know it meant that one day, be it soon or in the distant future, I would step off the pier at Newman's Lake and into the disgusting water, and I will let myself drown. Some things cannot be explained by the realm of the natural. I understood that it was strange that I could see my own death, but I also understood it as fact rather than my opinion. As soon as the black fish noticed me looking at it, it hid amongst the weeds. I knew it wouldn't come out while I was still there, so I walked back along the dock back to my mom. It was odd. After witnessing your own death, you would think I'd be afraid, but instead, I just felt empty, as if my own demise were sad, but not something to dwell on. And in a way, it wasn't like I learned anything new that day. I'd already known that I'd die one day. It wasn't as if I learned when I would die, just how. I simply told myself that I wouldn't go back to the lake, not for a long time. And I let myself believe it. The next summer, when my mom asked if I wanted to go to Newman's Lake for another picnic, I suggested we go to the local park instead. My mother seemed confused, but off to the park we went, and we all had a good time. It continued like that each year, with me finding some excuse not to go back to Newman's Lake. It continued until I was 17. My friends, Sam, Jason, and I were drinking cheap beers at Jason's parents' house while they were out of town. We played so many times that we'd run almost completely out of truth or dare questions when Sam asked the truth of how I wanted to die. And I answered as honestly as I could that it didn't matter how I wanted to die, that death was waiting for me, already assigned, at the bottom of Newman's Lake. I should have known not to tell him something like this. Should have known when Jason's mouth formed a tiny O and his brow frowned, or when Sam laughed out loud. But I was drunk, and they were my friends, and I thought they'd at least understand. I should have protested when Sam, the most sober of us, dragged Jason and I into his old minivan, but I didn't. I didn't want to be seen as a baby, so when they suggested we go to the pond, I went with them. My friends didn't need to know the dread that filled my entire body over the drive, or the chills on the back of my neck when I realized that I wanted to go back. They didn't need to know that when they started heckling me to approach the now nearly falling over pier, it took almost no effort on their part. They didn't need to know that I felt the strangest sense of home from deep within the murky depths of the water. As I performed the balancing act to the end of the pier yet again, my friends did not follow. I couldn't tell if it was fear of falling into the water or fear of whatever was clearly happening to me. I didn't care. I reached the end of the dock, and in the water, yet again, I saw it. It was still just as pitch black as before, but now about the size of my hand. Because it was bigger now, I could clearly see the swirling patterns within the fish. The extra plane of space it seemed to occupy beneath everything else. It was disorienting to watch, and yet I couldn't seem to pull my eyes away from it. It didn't seem to shy away from my gaze this time, but stayed completely still as if to let me watch the patterns on its back. I was mesmerized, and if my friends hadn't been behind me yelling my name, I don't know how long I would have stood there. I walked back to the edge of the lake and saw them looking terrified. "What the hell was that?" Sam asked, his voice almost accusatory. "I told you, I'm going to die here one day. Some things are just meant to happen," I said blankly, already missing the sounds of the water jostling the dock. As the years passed, I grew weary of getting too close to people. In my dreams, I was already under the gentle waves of the lake. What use would friends be when I eventually succumbed? After high school, I got a part-time job and took college classes online. With no real friends, no romantic prospects, and no hobbies. Sometimes I felt like the cool water would be mercy from the prison of homework and petty work drama. It was around that time I started visiting the lake pretty much daily. My job at the local sporting goods store was a short drive from it, and after every shift, I'd drive to the lake, sit at the end of the pier, and talk to the fish that was my death. I started telling stories about my life sometimes. It felt natural that the thing that would end it should know about my life. Sometimes I'd smoke cigarettes, or on especially bad days, just play music without speaking. Those were the days I most thought about jumping in, though in retrospect, I thought about it every day. I dreamt of it. I began looking forward to getting off of work and going to the lake. The fish was getting bigger and harder to miss when I searched the depths of the murky water. While at first it shied away, it was now impossible to miss, practically the size of a shark. Sometimes I could swear it was reacting to my voice, shimmying its fin in ways or that signified it was listening. And each day, I got a little closer to the water. Not so close as to fall or be pulled in by the massive fish, but close enough that I could observe the tiny colonies under the water and wish that I could join them. It was around that time that Jason showed up at my doorstep. He moved away after high school to go to a university, and we lost touch after. I had left my parents' home, but not the town itself. He seemed nervous, but I invited him in and we caught up for a while before I asked him about the nature of his unannounced visit. He hesitated, but overcame his anxiousness to look serious for just a moment. "Do you remember that time in high school when you got drunk and told us how you were going to die?" He practically whispered. I nodded. Jason began again. "I know how you feel. I see it everywhere. When I'm driving, I see it pulling me towards the oncoming traffic. When I'm at home, I feel it pulling me towards the kitchen knives or rope. I can sense it with me all the time. But I just want to tell you, it's not set in stone. You don't have to listen." I was horrified. I never knew that while I was fighting my battle with the lake, Jason fought just as hard. In this shared kinship, I felt happy. For the first time in a long time. I'd avoided making connections for so long that it felt odd welcoming someone into my life, but I knew it was what had to be done. "Thank you. It's good to know I'm not alone. I'm here for you, anytime you need me," I told him. My death still calls to me. Sometimes I still feel the urge to go to the lake and visit, but I know that death will welcome me with open arms like an old friend, and I don't want it to catch me with my guard down. Jason and I are friends, and we help each other through difficult days. The days where I dream about the sweet cocoon of water all around me, or Jason holds a knife in his hand as if it were attached. I don't belong at the bottom of the lake, no matter how it calls to me. And with Jason by my side, I hope that we can eventually die by anything other than our own hands. My husband and I promised to each other that we would never forget how weird the experience was. About 2 years ago, I went to collect my husband from the ferry after work. My husband got into the car as I was driving very slow out of the car park. We both noticed two people standing a few meters in front of our car. It looked as though they were strangers, older looking professionals, both walking to their separate cars in different areas of the car park. The man was reaching into his side bag, and the lady was further ahead than the man, with her head turned to the right. I know the exact positions they were in because they were completely frozen on the spot. My husband and I sat there watching the frozen strangers, not saying anything to each other. And then, all of a sudden, it was like someone pressed play and the two strangers just continued on like nothing had happened. My husband and I promised to each other that we would never forget how weird this experience was. I can't remember exactly how long they stayed frozen like, but it was long enough to freak us both out. It was the worst day of my life. Every day since has been a living nightmare. I should have never let her drive in that storm. What was I thinking? Even now, 3 years later, she doesn't even remember me. Yes, Daphne understands she has a father, and it's me, but only on a superficial level. I mean nothing to her. Less than nothing. In fact, a lifetime of memories gone, for her at least. Oh, I try regaling her with stories of her forgotten past. Her first bicycle, which after showing off to all the boys on the block, she crashed. How she came running home, bloodied nose and scraped knees, wailing in distress, her mother tending to her wounds, while I rushed to the store for some ice cream. Cookies and cream, her favorite, or her first ballerina competition. She was so nervous, she cried the entire trip. But once she set foot on the dance studio, she found her courage and delivered a stunning performance. This performance is recorded. When I showed her, hoping it sparked some memories, she became pugnacious and cruel. To her, it was like watching a stranger, or worse, an imposter. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why not start new memories and build upon them? Believe me, I tried. In a perfect world, or maybe a Disney flick, this would have worked. But not in real life. At least, not in my life. She trusts no one from her before time, especially her parents. It was her 17th birthday. I remember it like yesterday. How could I forget the day I lost my daughter? Or more accurately, she lost me. Daphne was a straight-A student, a gift she acquired from our mother's side of the family. My side, we're a bunch of blue-collar stiffs, working back-breaking jobs for long hours at a time. My work is no different, but I don't mind. I'd do anything for my daughter. Unbeknownst to Daphne, her mother and I had been saving for years, not only for her post-secondary education. She planned on becoming a veterinarian, but also for her first car. Now, I'm not gonna lie, her mother was dead set against giving her the shiny new Camaro SS, candy apple red, of course. Daphne, she said on several occasions, doesn't need a fancy car. She needs a practice vehicle that is safe and does good on gas. My wife Tara had a point, but I'm a guy who loves a nice set of wheels. Ultimately, this was an argument I was bound to win. A miracle, I know. Daphne's birthday went off without a hitch. She had 12 of her closest friends with her. We barbecued shrimps and steaks and had enough hors d'oeuvres to sink the Titanic. Her best friend Bryce even serenaded us on his 12-string acoustic guitar afterwards. By then, many of the neighbors had moseyed over, cashing in on the festivities. Finally, the moment arrived. Up until now, we kept her present a secret. Daphne hates secrets, but she did her best to contain herself. She'd received plenty of cool stuff from her friends and relatives, including a black hangover hoodie from Bryce. along with a plethora of emoji necklaces, fairy lights, noise-canceling headphones, and a personalized makeup kit. Stuff I know nothing about. As the party wound down and parents started trickling in, I sneaked away next door. You see, David, my next door neighbor, was storing the Camaro in his garage and had been over a week. I pulled the new shiny sports car into the driveway and honked. Daphne has an abundance of energy. At least she used to. She gets this from my side of the family. That and her fiery red hair, which matched her new ride. She came rushing over. The look of surprise and adoration on her freckled face was enough to make me cry. I wiped fresh tears from my face as she hugged me tightly, then stole the keys from my hand. She jumped inside. The leather seats greeted her like an old friend. "Oh my God," she cried. "I love it." I knew she would. That's how I justified putting myself in so much debt. A father will do anything for daddy's little girl. Yes, she would have been satisfied with a Corolla or an Accord, boring but reliable. This would have made her mother happy. Except Daphne, being like her father, prefers something with a little more kick, something with pizzazz. Immediately, she was the envy of her friends who gathered around the driveway, awestruck. I detected a tinge of jealousy coming from the other parents as they retreated to their SUVs. This wasn't my intention, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel wonderful. The party wrapped up. Only Bryce remained. I could tell Daphne was eager to take it for a test ride. She hadn't left the driver's seat. I didn't blame her. It's not an ornament. It's a car. Cars belong on the open road, careening across the freeway at jet speed, especially sports cars with V8 engines, fat tires, and boisterous engines. Or so I thought. The humidity gave way. A thunderstorm was inevitable. Gray, foreboding clouds were wafting in. Flashes of white lightning and voluptuous thunder crashed in the distance. Droplets of rain fell, promising more. Bryce sat quietly in the passenger seat, fiddling with his phone. Meanwhile, my daughter was staring at me with ocean blue eyes, begging for a test ride. How could I give her this car, then immediately take it away? Her eyes petitioned. My fatherly instincts were screaming, "No, don't let her go out in this storm. She can test ride tomorrow, or at least when the storm settles down." Daphne pleaded. She made clever arguments that only a teenage girl can. She pulled at all my heartstrings, never letting go. Finally, I agreed. All she wanted was to drive around the block, pick up some coffees, then return. Back in a jiffy, she promised, reluctantly, and to my wife's chagrin, I agreed. Don't judge. A dad is weak against his teenage daughter, as any father knows. Besides, my pops let me drive his pickup truck once I was tall enough to reach the pedals. We drive in conditions that made this storm look like a summer breeze. Daphne learned on our Toyota RAV4, boring yet reliable. A far cry from the Camaro parked in our driveway. But my daughter's no slouch. She'll be fine. The roads were wet, but visibly satisfactory. The storm crashed in the distance, warning otherwise. The rumble of the thunder promised havoc. By now, I was soaked to the skin. "Be careful," I said, using my best fatherly ever tone. "Don't worry, Daddy. Be back soon. I love you lots." She turned the key. The car roared to life. It sounded like a symphony. As she pulled away, the precious words, "Love you lots," warmed my heart. Those were the last kind words she'd ever say to me. 1 hour had passed. She hadn't returned. My wife groaned. "Something's wrong. I just know it." As usual, I downplayed the alarm. Now, Daphne's a teenager with a cool car. I'm sure she's fine. We sent several texts. all unanswered. She's driving, I asserted. She probably has her Bluetooth set up, with tunes cranked. I did my best to remain calm. The torrential downpour did nothing to help my shaky nerves. Another half hour passed. By now, my wife wasn't the only one freaking out. I too was angst-ridden. Calling the police over a teenage girl missing for under 2 hours was futile, although that's what I wanted to do. Instead, I hopped into my RAV4 and set out looking for her. I knew this search was in vain, but sitting around doing nothing was no longer an option. The rain was an unwelcome guest. I drove through the streets with the wipers on max. The swishing of the wipers did nothing to soothe my anguish. After cruising around town, visiting her usual spots, I gave up and returned home, feeling downtrodden and dejected. Hopefully my wife had better news. She didn't. My wife greeted me with swollen eyes, punishing in their intensity. She knew as well as I, something was terribly wrong, and it was my fault. Then the call came. The call every parent fears. There's been an accident. I don't recall what happened next. The phone fell from my face, replaced by my hands as I wept. My wife, God bless her, took over from there. She jotted down the information, then rushed us both to the ER. The drive took forever. The streets were slick, and although the rain had subsided, the streetlights were laser beams glaring off of the waterlogged roads. Visibility poor. Tara white-knuckled it the entire way, refusing to speak. Her silence was a dagger to my heart. Purple veins bulged from her neck. The lines around her eyes deepened. I can hear the whistling of her breath as it passed through her nostrils. Still no words. Oh, how I wish she'd say something. Anything, even if it came at my expense, which it would indubitably would. In our 20-year marriage, I'd never seen her so upset. There was a monster brewing inside of her, a monster waiting to escape. Finally, we arrived, paying for parking and finding the appropriate entrance felt like an eternity. Nothing we could do was quick enough. I needed to see my daughter pronto. Once inside the hospital, we were greeted with more bad news. The receptionist was a portly woman with dark skin and heavy hair. She seemed pleasant, but fatally exhausted. Daphne, she told us, had been in a serious car accident. Her car collided with a transport truck. The car was totaled. Bryce, who came away with minor scrapes and bruises and would likely suffer from whiplash, was sent home. Daphne, on the other hand, remains in serious condition, her fate undetermined. We filled out a mountain of paperwork. Meanwhile, my wife was unraveling, her hands unsteady as she penned the appropriate information. Her nose tightened. Her bottom lip quivered, as she does when she's brooding. As we journeyed up the stuffy elevator, seemingly for days, her hatred towards me intensified. When we made eye contact, albeit briefly, her eyes were as cold as a gunslinger's heart. Tara had yet to speak to me. A voice sprung into my head. "This is all your fault," it said. I couldn't leave the elevator soon enough. The walls inched closer and closer, threatening to trap me inside. The onslaught of panic seemed inevitable. I didn't know what to do, so I wiped the sweat from my brow and waited. After an eternity, the door swung open and I stepped out. We walked. Tara's high heels clicking the cold linoleum floor echoed for days. The sound was infuriating, so was her silence. All the while, the voice in my head pestered, each word growing louder and louder until I was ready to throw myself off of a tall building. "This is all your fault," The voice said, again and again, like a schoolyard bully. You should have never let her drive. I shoved my hands over my ears, stifling a scream. The voices was maddening. I turned to my wife for support and found none. Her hateful glare made one thing abundantly clear. She too had the voices ringing inside her head. This was as plain as the pale paint covering the drab hospital walls. This is his fault, the voice told her. He's to blame. My guilt was a guillotine. The sound of weeping pervaded us. Each room seemed sadder than the previous one. The hospital was a cesspool of sorrow. Misery loves company, right? It took every ounce of strength not to fall to my knees and surrender to it. Meanwhile, terror's heels clicked away like spikes into a coffin. The long, dreary hallway stretched on. Eventually, we reached Daphne's room, and I sighed. With a knotted stomach, I opened the door and shuddered. The scene was repugnant. My eyes switched on and off, assessing what they were seeing. The room was empty, save for one hospital bed. On it, a figure cloaked in pasty white full-body cast and hooked up to an IV lay lifelessly. Our daughter. Her face was ravaged in scars, her lips as lifeless as a corpse. Her eyes remained shut. Apparently, she had more broken bones than a career boxer. We sat next to her. The hospital chairs felt like rocks. We waited in stifled silence, still not speaking. Nurses came and went. Although they explained the direness of Daphne's situation, I paid little attention. How could I? All I could do was listen to the nagging voice in my head. This is all your fault, Chuck. You did this. Why? Why did you let her drive? There was a storm. Tears spilt from my door face like a leaky faucet. I cried more that night than I had in my entire life. The voice in my head was indeed correct. This was all my fault. My wife would have preferred if I stayed home. Her eyes told me so. This did nothing to ease my heartache. Even as the nurses told us our options, my wife simply nodded, as if to say, yes, tell me something I don't know. At least Tara was engaged with them. I, on the other hand, sat brutally on a chair of rocks, teary-eyed and confused, clutching my daughter's clammy hands as if my life depended upon it. Maybe it did. With all my might, I prayed she'd be okay. The nurse said it was time to leave. When I tried letting go of my sick daughter's hand, I couldn't. My hands clung to hers. As I slowly released them, something peculiar happened. Daphne shifted. The room gasped. All eyes fell upon her. It wasn't much, but it was something. I leaned in close so I can feel the warmth of her breath. She twitched, then her eyes flashed open. You can hear a pin drop inside that stuffy hospital room. We all felt it. Daphne's blue eyes were chilling. It was like staring into the eyes of a stranger, or worse, a demon. Something was wrong. Something else was lying in plaster, covered in sores and bruises. This couldn't be my little girl. This wasn't Daphne. Finally, my daughter spoke. Her words, like a switchblade knife, spilled my guts and entrails across the floor. A part of me died right then and there. As our eyes met, something coursed through me. Something evil. She grimaced as she spoke, her voice as empty as a blue sky. Who the hell are you? This is your buddy Darkness, and remember, darkness is only a switch away.